Day 3, Advanced Tips for Content Apps by Tim Payne. Content apps are a great way to display extra information about your pages in the CMS. You might use one to display Google tracking information, for example. But what if you want to do something more complicated? What are content apps? Content apps were added in V8 and add an excellent way of showing extra information about your pages in the back office. I'm not going to go into too much information about the basics of content apps, as you can read about that in the documentation, which can be found on the documentation site. I've seen them used for all sorts of things, from displaying analytics data to displaying SEO information about the page you're currently editing. But what if you want to do something a bit more complicated? In this article, we're going to walk through creating a content app that does something a bit more than just display some information, and in the process, look at some of the issues that we might run into and try to solve them using some advanced tips and tricks I've learned for using content apps. We'll be using the basic Umbraco starter kit as our starting point and building on that. There is a public Github repo with all of the code from this article available, and I'll link to that at the bottom of the article so you can put it down and have a play with the finished site. Let's talk versions. All of the examples in this article are using V9 as the latest version of Umbraco. However, everything that I'm doing here can also be done in V8, so people on older versions of Umbraco don't need to miss out. All of the front-end HTML views and controllers should work as is. It'll just be any server-side code that might be different. I'll try and note what changes you need to make to use this in V8 as I go along. In writing this article, I'm using Visual Studio, but there's no reason why you can't use VS Code, Rider, or any other .NET IDE if you prefer. Our content app. We're going to create a content app that allows a CMS editor to import some news/blog type articles onto the site as a CSV from the main news/blog page. The user will be able to click on the app, upload a CSV file, and we'll have an API controller that will process the file and add the new pages to the CMS underneath the main news blog section. We're going to try and use built-in Umbraco components and styling so that it shouldn't look out of place in the back office. We'll look at how to add the app and some of the issues that we encounter and how we can get around them. Adding the app. We'll assume that you have an install of Umbraco 9 set up and that you've installed the basic starter kit. First, let's add our plugin to the app plugin folder. We're going to add an empty controller.js file and the HTML for the view with just some dummy content for now to check it works. Here's a picture of the added code in VS. I've created a folder called 24 days in the app plugins folder to house our files. I've called the content app view file app.html and the controller 24days.controller.js. The app view file contains just an H1 with some dummy text for now. Next up, we'll add the package.manifest file in our plugin folder, which can be seen below. All we're doing here is setting the icon and title of the content app, and then telling Umbraco which document types to show it on, the blog page in our case. Let's rebuild the site and have a look in the back office and see if we can see our content app on the blog page. Woohoo! Success! But wait, this is where we run into our first issue. First issue. We need more advanced permissions. But we have our app showing, so what's the big issue? Well, content apps can only be assigned to document types. You can't specify in the default configuration if the app's shown when an item is being added or edited. Why is that a problem? Well, in this case, it's because our app is going to allow you to upload content underneath the blog page. If you're adding a new blog page and haven't saved it yet, you can't upload child pages because there's nothing to upload it to, and attempting to do so will throw an error. So we need to find a way to only show our app if the page being viewed is already published. But how do we do that? Fortunately, in Umbraco, rather than use the more basic package manifest, we can register the content app in our code instead, which gives us more control over the display logic for the app. First, you can remove the content app definition from the package.manifest, leaving just the JS registration in there. Next, we'll add a folder called Content Apps and add a class for our content app there. The classes we use to register and load the content app via code. You can see that we define the content app and then add the logic for whether we display the app there. Inside the class, we can check pretty much anything we like. In this case, we're just checking if it's content, the document type, and whether the page's ID is 0 or not. We've also got the code to register the content app in the same file at the top. You could split this out separately if you wanted to. If you're using V8 of Umbraco, the code for this is slightly different. You can still create the app in your code, but you wire it in using a component and see the namespaces will be slightly different. The details can be found here. Add in the upload and import functionality. Okay, now we're going to flesh out the content app. Nothing too fancy here. We're going to add an upload field to the content app and hook into a controller that we're going to create to accept the upload and add the title and excerpt of new blog posts underneath the blog list page and save them, but not publish them. We're going to use the built-in Umbraco backoffice UI elements so that everything looks like it's part of the backoffice UI. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but here's the code that we've now added. The app view, the JS controller for the app view, the controller that we post the file to, we're using a NuGet package called CSV helper to read the CSV file that we upload. We're not doing any validation or anything fancy, as this is just an example. We assume that the title is in the first column and that the second column has the excerpt. We also assume that the first row of the CSV file has the headers in it. You can call them whatever you like, as we're not referring to them in our code, but in a more robust solution, you might want to validate field header names, etc. CSV Helper has support for this, as well as for mapping to POCOs and objects. With the code here, all the front-end code should work as is in V8, but you may need to update some namespaces, etc. in the controller that we post to make it work correctly. And here we can see our app, which looks like part of the back office thanks to the use of our back office UI elements and directives. All done. So now if we upload a CSV with some content in, we should see a success message. Yay, right? Right? Second issue, the list view doesn't update with the imported pages. Not so fast. This is where we hit our second issue. After import, click on the list view for the child pages, and there's no sign of the new pages we brought in. Does this mean it didn't work? Not quite. If you refresh the page in the browser, you'll see the new pages have been added, but the list view wasn't updated when we added them. This isn't a massive issue, but it is bad UI for the users who may assume that the content they imported has not actually run, and run the import lots of times, resulting in lots of duplicate content. It took a lot of looking through source code to figure out a way of doing this, but I discovered that the list view does have a way of refreshing the list view content. There's code in the JS controller that will refresh the list views if the language is changed in the back office. I couldn't find a way to call that directly from our app, but what I settled on was this. Emit an event on upload in our content app to the root scope, which all Angular components have access to. Create a custom list view that's based on the built-in one, and add a listener there for our emitted event, and refresh the list view when it happens. Firstly, let's modify the app.js controller to emit our custom event. All we're going to do is add the following line of code. Rootscope.emit, refresh custom list view, underneath the call to notification service.success, open brackets, response, close brackets. All this line does is emit an event on the root scope that the other things can listen out for. In order to do this, you need to pass in root scope to your JS controller's constructor, so it can be accessed by your code. Now we'll create our custom list view template and controller and add them to our project. In our controller, we're going to listen for the custom event we're emitting, and when it fires, we'll call the refresh function on the main list view that refreshes all the list views. To do this, I've just copied the built-in code for the list type list view and added some extra code to listen out for our special event. The key part here is at the bottom where we listen for our custom event on the root scope, and then we handle it. We call our function that calls the built-in refresh list view function that lives higher up in the Angular scope tree. We can handily get at it using the parent property of the scopes. Next, update the package manifest to include our new controller, and finally, we'll edit the default list view for content to use our new list view instead of the built-in one. If we rebuild or reload the site and go to the import and run it, and then click the list view for child items, we should now see our imported items showing on the list without needing to reload the page. Because we've replaced the default list views, this now means we can use this feature on all of the content list views. For this example, I've just redone the standard list style view template, but you could do the grid style one as well if you wanted to. All of the code for this part should work in both V8 and V9, as it's all front end. Hopefully this has been interesting and given you some ideas about more complicated things you can do with content apps. Future improvements. This example is very basic. We don't do any duplicate checking on the import, and we're only setting a couple of properties. You could make the import much more robust if you wanted to. If you wanted an audit trail, you could even add an audit trail and display a history of imports in the Content tab underneath the import. We're also not validating the uploaded CSV file, so you may want to do some checking for things like required columns, whether any required fields are missing, etc. The Angular code for some of this is a little bit hacky. There's probably a better way of doing some of the things that I've done here around communicating between scopes and components. There's probably plenty of room for improving on my JavaScript. I'm also doing things like calling the backoffice API from within the JS controller for the Content app. But you might want to split that out into its own Angular resource, especially if you want to reuse the code. Github Repo. There is a Github repo available with a working version of the code that we've built in this article. You can download the repo and build it and have a play with the code. Full instructions on running the site and logins for the CMS, etc. are in the README for the repo. You can access the repo here.